I'm going to run through the background and scientific rationale to the CRASH-3 trial so that we all understand what the science basis for this trial is. Well, I don't need to tell you that traumatic brain injury is a big problem. About 10 million killed every year. Many times more people seriously injured, permanently disabled. Most of these deaths and serious injuries are in lower middle income countries, and most involve young adults, and that means high levels of permanent disability. So it often involves the breadwinner in the family, so it has a big economic impact on the whole family. And the incidence of TBI is expected to rise. Most TBI comes from road traffic crashes. The road traffic crashes are on the ascendancy in most of the world with the increase in motorization. So, in fact, this slide shows some of that data, that road traffic crashes are predicted by the WHO to go from something like 9th to 6th as in the kind of rankings of causes of death. So whereas other things like infectious diseases are predicted to decline, trauma is predicted to increase. That's why it's really important that we have an effective treatment of trauma. So this is the typical situation that we see in low and middle income countries. So most of the victims of road traffic crash in low and middle income countries are vulnerable road users. They're outside the car. In high income countries, it's people inside cars, but in low and middle income countries, it's pedestrians. So this pedestrian, hit by the bumper, folds over, head hits the bonnet, lump of metal just under the bonnet with the engine, head hits the engine, serious head injury. To some extent, there's sort of insult added to injury, because despite the fact that this is a huge problem, we know very little about what works in the treatment of traumatic brain injury. So this is just three different interventions. Now, if somebody had a serious head injury here today and you were taken into hospital, you'd probably get one of these treatments. So you'd either get a mannitol infusion, you might get hyperventilation, or you might get barbiturates to reduce raised intracranial pressure. Now, this slide shows the evidence from randomized controlled trials for each of those interventions. And basically, none of them have been shown to be effective. They're all mannitol, could increase the risk, could decrease the risk, hyperventilation likewise, barbiturates likewise. So there's lots and lots of uncertainty about the effectiveness of most treatments for head injuries. Now, so what works in head injury? Well, to be honest, we don't really know what works. It's very unlikely that there's going to be a magical cure, because some of the damage is done at the time of impact. But there is potential for limiting the damage through effective treatments. So large treatment effects are unlikely, but even a little bit of benefit would be worthwhile, because if you could get a little bit of benefit for a lot of people, that could translate to a lot of benefit overall. Now, to find modest treatment effects, clinical trials have to be big. So it's all about signal and noise. If you want to find a modest signal, you have to keep background noise down, and that means randomizing lots of patients. And also the trials have to be properly randomized. So if you're trying to find a modest treatment effect, you can't tolerate a modest bias. So that means properly randomized trials. So large randomized trials is what we need to find effective treatments. Now, the first large, properly randomized trial in traumatic brain injury was the CRASH study, the CRASH trial. This is a placebo-controlled trial of corticosteroids in patients with head injury. This trial was answering the question about whether steroids are effective or not. At the time it was launched, half the world's patients got steroids and the other half didn't. So there was a big debate in the neurosurgical community. Some doctors thought it was effective, some doctors thought it wasn't. But lots and lots of patients were being treated with this drug, corticosteroids. We did a large randomized controlled trial. At the CRASH-1 trial, we found out that steroids increased the risk of death by about 2%. Now this is a disappointing result. You always hope a result will, the treatment's going to be effective. But knowing that this treatment didn't work was really important because the treatment was being used in clinical practice. In fact, the Lancet estimated that something like 10,000 deaths had been caused from doctors using this treatment that didn't actually work. So either way, finding out if treatments are effective is important for patients, but also not effective. We need to know that too. This unfortunate man's just been hit by a Toyota in Thailand, and his brain is probably swelling inside his skull, and he will be having an intracranial bleed. Intracranial bleeding is really common after severe head injury. So there's just like you get bleeding anywhere in the body after injury, after head injury. There's a bleed inside the brain, and that's what the CRASH-3 trial is fundamentally about. So this slide shows blood and blood clotting. So you can see here that you've got these red blood cells in a wound, and you've got all of this yellow stuff, this yellow tangle. Now this is fibrin. Fibrin is the start of a blood clot. So these fibrin strands gather together and get into a sort of web. Blood cells clog up in the web, and it sort of forms a dam to stop the blood coming out any further. And this is the basic pathology that the CRASH-3 trial is looking at, because there's an enzyme in the body called plasmin that chops up those fibrin strands. And if you chop up those fibrin strands, you actually weaken the blood clot and let bleeding continue. So this is what plasmin looks like. Well, I'm sure it doesn't really look like this, but it's a schematic of plasmin. This is the enzyme that chops up those blood clots. Now, about many years ago, people started looking for a drug that could inhibit this enzyme. So basically, this is the precursor of plasminogen, binding to fibrin, so binding to those blood clots before it chops them up. And researchers looked for a chemical that would block the binding of plasmin to fibrinogen, and they found one. They found this drug called Tranexamic acid that blocks that binding, and so that inhibits, that prevents plasmin from chopping up the fibrin, and in that way it helps bleeding. Now, we know it helps bleeding because we've got lots of evidence from surgical patients. So this is a systematic review and meta-analysis of data from 95 randomized controlled trials of the effect of tranexamic acid on bleeding in surgery. And what it shows is that tranexamic acid dramatically reduces the risk of needing a blood transfusion. So if you've got tranexamic acid, your risk of receiving a blood transfusion is reduced by about a third, nearly a 40% reduction in fact. And this is highly statistically significant, so this isn't a fluke. So we know that tranexamic acid reduces bleeding in surgery. We also know that it stops people bleeding to death after major trauma. This is what the CRASH-2 trial was about. So the CRASH-2 trial was a trial of tranexamic acid in bleeding trauma patients. 20,000 trauma patients were randomly allocated. 10,000 got tranexamic acid, 10,000 got placebo. And there was highly statistically significant reduction in the risk of bleeding to death in those that got tranexamic acid. So now we've got two sets of data. We know that tranexamic acid reduces bleeding in surgery. We know it reduces the chances of bleeding to death in trauma. So it's doing something important in hemorrhage. The question is, can it do something important in hemorrhage inside the brain, when the brain is bleeding? So Bleeding is common after traumatic brain injury. It's a very common complication. It's associated with worse outcome. And the bigger the bleed, the more bleeding into the brain, the worse the patient's outcome. Now this is the important point. It's not all done at the time of injury. At the time of injury, there'll be some bleeding, but that bleeding will continue into the brain for 24 to 48 hours. So there is the potential to stop the bleeding into the brain, and that's what we want to see if tranexamic acid can achieve. Because if it does that, we hope it will improve the patient outcome, and there'll be less death and less disability. So this problem with clotting, we also know that this plasmid cutting up the blood clot thing, that happens in patients with traumatic brain injury. About a third of patients with traumatic brain injury, they have abnormal clotting. And this cutting up of the fibrin is called fibrinolysis. So it's common after brain injury, and it's associated with worse outcome. Now, there have been 2 randomized controlled trials of tranexamic acid in traumatic brain injury. I'm going to show you the first. The first was a sub-study we did within the CRASH-2 trial. So patients going into the CRASH-2 trial who also had a traumatic brain injury had a CT scan before randomization and then a CT scan 24 hours later. And then we compared the CT scans in those who got tranexamic acid and those who got placebo. We found that there was less expansion of the intracranial hemorrhage in those who got tranexamic acid. So that's, it wasn't a statistically significant reduction, but it was going in the right direction. Now, one of the concerns was that actually, okay, well, you can reduce the amount of bleeding, but you might get more unwanted clotting. The good news in this small sub-study is that we didn't find any increase in ischemia, that's brain ischemia from unwanted clotting. In fact, there was half as much unwanted clotting in the patients who got the tranexamic acid. So here we find it reduces bleeding without increasing the risk of ischemic side effects. There was actually less death in the patients who got tranexamic acid, but it's quite a small study, not statistically significant. So hemorrhage growth down if you got tranexamic acid, mortality down if you got tranexamic acid. Now, on its own, this sub-study was quite small, and the results are not very reliable because we didn't have big enough numbers. Fortunately, there was another study of exactly the same treatment conducted in Thailand, and what we can do is add the results of the 2 studies together. So this is the CRASH-2 study and the Thai study. They both showed very similar effects on intracranial bleeding. And if you add them up together, you get a significant reduction in intracranial bleeding in those who got tranexamic acid. The confidence intervals are quite wide, so we can't be completely sure about this, but the effects are really exciting and really in the right direction, quite promising. We also saw a reduction in mortality in the Thai study. And now again, we can add the 2 studies together in a meta-analysis, and we see a statistically significant reduction in mortality in those who got tranexamic acid. But again, only just. We'd like to be more sure of this result by conducting a bigger trial. So that's what the CRASH-3 trial is about. We've got very good basis to conduct this trial. We've got 2 pilot studies that show less bleeding, less mortality, but we want to be sure about it. That's why we've got to do a bigger trial. So the CRASH-3 trial is a randomized, placebo-controlled trial of tranexamic acid in patients with traumatic brain injury to see if it will reduce mortality and disability, because those are the things that matter to patients. Now, the trial has to be randomized because we can't tolerate moderate bias. So we've got to eliminate bias. Eliminating bias means properly randomized. The trial's placebo-controlled, and that's important because it helps minimise bias in outcome assessment. Some people are concerned in trials that involve placebo. They think we're denying an effective treatment to patients. We're not doing that in the CRASH-3 at all. All patients get all the known effective treatments, but on top of that, they either get tranexamic acid or placebo. So we're not denying patients any effective treatment. They all get what doctors would normally give, but on top of that, they get tranexamic acid or placebo, and we do that to help make sure that neither the researchers, or the doctors, or the patients, or anybody knows what the patient got, and that helps to minimise bias. So, patients who can go in the CRASH-3 trial are adults with traumatic brain injury who are within 8 hours of their injury, who either have intracranial bleeding on a CT scan or they have a GCS less than 12 and no significant extracranial bleeding, provided that the responsible doctor is substantially uncertain whether or not to use tranexamic acid. So I'll go through each of those points in more detail. Why are we focusing on adults? Well, firstly, the main reason is because this is an emergency situation, and we want to use a fixed dose because weighing people in emergency situations is logistically difficult. And so it's good if you can use a fixed dose, but you can't use a fixed dose with children because they come in all different shapes and sizes. So we're focusing this on adults. But if we show that the treatment works in adults, people will extrapolate the results to children. We're including patients who are treated within 8 hours of injury. That's because pilot studies used that time window and they showed evidence of benefit. So we're doing the same thing as we did in the 2 pilot studies, the CRASH-2 intracranial bleeding study and the TIE study. They both showed evidence of benefit, so we're sticking with that recipe. Patients can be included in the trial if they've got intracranial bleeding on the first CT scan. So if someone sees intracranial bleeding on the first CT scan, that bleeding can get worse. So that's the patient group we want. But there are many parts of the world where you can't get a CT scan really rapidly. We want these results to be generalizable to the whole world. Now, we don't want to say to doctors in those countries, well, actually, I'm sorry, you can't take part in the CRASH-3 trial. So if you can't have a CT scan rapidly, if no CT scans available, patients can be put in the trial if their GCS, that's their Glasgow Coma Scale score, is less than 12. And the reason that we're doing that is because we know from previous research that most of those patients will have an intracranial bleed. So at least 70% of patients with a GCS of less than 12 will go on to have an intracranial bleed. So it's safe to put those into the trial. So we're interested in reducing any sort of intracranial bleeding. So all patients, any intracranial bleed that's seen on a CT scan can be put, those patients can be put in the trial. Now, a lot of people get concerned about this uncertainty principle. So this is when we say, well, look, the responsible doctor is substantially uncertain about whether or not to put the patient in the trial. This is only really a restatement of good ethical practice. If a doctor felt that a patient couldn't benefit from a treatment, then they shouldn't put the patient in the trial. Similarly, if they felt that the patient would be harmed by a particular treatment, then they shouldn't put the patient in the trial. They would have to be uncertain about its effectiveness to put the patient in the trial. So this is not something new and unusual. It's just a restatement of normal, good ethical practice. And it's the recipe that's been used for many large-scale clinical trials. Now, we exclude patients with significant extracranial bleeding, that's bleeding in the body, in the chest, or in the abdomen, because we already know that tranexamic acid improves outcome in these patients. So we're talking in this trial, the CRASH-3 trial, to patients with traumatic brain injury at risk of significant intracranial bleeding, but who don't have extracranial bleeding, because we'd like to give tranexamic acid to those patients. Now we have to give treatment as soon as possible because time is of the essence. This injury's happened, the bleeding is oozing out into the brain, and we're trying to prevent it. So this is a patient who's in the CRASH-2 sub-study. This is their scan at admission, and this is their scan 24 hours later. So this white blob here is an intracranial bleed. So that's bleeding into the substance of the brain. And you can see that over that 24 hours it's got much worse. So we want to be as close as possible to this situation. We want to reduce it to the full extent possible so that there is no excuse for delay. Patients have to be randomized as soon as possible. This is an emergency. As the patient lying in front of you, they could be losing neurological function. They could be losing brain tissue. So it's very important that we randomize the patient as soon as possible. Now, this is a randomized controlled trial. We hope the treatment's going to improve outcome, but we don't know that for sure. So we have to make sure that there's somebody looking carefully at patient safety issues. And there's a special committee called the Data Monitoring Committee whose job it is to do this. They see the data at regular intervals, as regularly as they want to. And they will look at the accumulating data in the trial. They will see what events happen in the treated group, what events happen in the control group. They can compare them. And if they think that the treatment is harmful and patients shouldn't be exposed to it, they will inform the steering committee, and the steering committee will stop recruitment. If they think the treatment is so fantastically effective that everybody deserves to get it, they will inform the steering committee, and the steering committee will decide whether to stop the trial. So there is a committee of people looking at the data on a regular basis to make sure it's safe for patients to be in this trial. They'll look at death, they'll look at side effects, vascular occlusive events, myocardial infarction, stroke, deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolism. They'll look at the risk of seizures. There's been some discussion from cardiac surgery where patients get very high doses of tranexamic acid, that tranexamic acid might cause seizures. We can't know this for sure because there have been no randomized trials, and we're using a much lower dose in the CRASH-3 study. But we're going to look at seizures as well, and the Data Monitoring Committee will get to see data on seizures and make sure we look at disability and any other adverse events or serious adverse events. So you can be reassured that there is a careful scrutiny of the safety issues in this trial. Now, why take part? Well, the results of the CRASH-2 study show why we should take part in clinical trials. This is an estimate of how many lives could be saved from giving tranexamic acid to bleeding trauma patients. So this is patients with extracranial hemorrhage. Something over 100,000 lives every year from this very cheap drug. It's a highly cost-effective treatment. Most of the benefit the countries where you'd stand to benefit is shown on this slide. So particularly China and India, large numbers of patients where trauma is really common, but also Russia, the United States, Brazil, South America, Africa. The whole world stands to benefit, so that's why this is global international collaboration. But if we show tranexamic acid is as effective as it is in extracranial injury in the CRASH-3 trial, then that would be a fantastic discovery, and it will influence the treatment, the care of treatment all around the world. It will be even more important than this result. So that's the reason to take part. This slide shows 100 grades. If tranexamic acid is effective in head injury as we think it could be, based on the previous pilot studies, then the graveyard would not look like that, it would look like that. So that's a significant benefit. I'm sure you'll agree. So so we're very grateful that you've taken part in the CRASH-3 trial. If you have any questions, the trial coordinating centre team is there to help you. Contact details are shown on the slide.